So I received a DM this week from somebody that listens to the show, and they had heard me talking about how I use Raycast and finally downloaded it for themselves. And all the DM said was, this is going to completely change the way that I use my computer, isn't it? And it's true. Once you realize how much Raycast streamlines the way you work and just how easy it makes it to stay in flow, you can't really go back. I use it for clipboard history, it's my portal to AI, window management, it's how I search for Figma files. So if you're still on the sidelines, I can't recommend Raycast enough. Head to dive.club/Raycast to get started. That's RAYCAST. Okay, now on to the episode.
I'm bringing my personas to life using 11 Labs and image generation, and I'm crafting these stories with this user in an airport and this user in like a market and like visualizing it. I would not be able to do any of that before because I'm a terrible drawer. I cannot make those beautiful storyboards that maybe other designers can, but today I can. So the goalposts are changing because there's going to be designers that are becoming extremely efficient in communicating their ideas and convincing their stakeholders. And it's not to scare you or put pressure on people. It's really just to be like, let's keep learning. Let's keep being curious. Let's keep growing as designers and creatives in the industry.
Welcome to Dive Club. My name is Rid, and this is where designers never stop learning. This week's episode is with Maheen Sohail, who's a senior staff designer working on generative AI at Meta. So a big part of this conversation is learning what it takes to thrive in ambiguity, especially when you're working in emerging tech. We get into different types of AI interface patterns, some of the unique ways that she thinks about prototyping, and one of my personal favorite parts of the conversation is learning about the importance of tinkering and exploring side projects in Maheen's learning journey. So let's start this conversation by hearing a bit about what it's like joining as one of the earliest designers on both the VR and the AI team at Meta.
So I've had an interesting career in the sense that I've been one of the first designers in emerging tech teams in a large company. I was the 5th designer ever in Meta / Oculus in their VR team. And then even in the AI team, I was like one of the early designers. Every time I've joined Gen AI or in the research teams, there's a sort of a playbook of how you actually enter a team like this. How do you enter a field like this when there's literally no designers industry-wide working in this space? And there's just these key things that I've learned as a playbook that I keep repeating every time I join a new product team like this, because I've learned that this is my happy space to join these early 0 to 1 emerging tech teams where there's a million questions and maybe like 1 or 2 answers, and that's it. And how do you navigate that? That's where I find, honestly, all of my passion, because that's where I get to design the most creative, innovative things that no one's thought of. And what a better place to be than for a designer to be at, you know? And that playbook in my mind, it's been these key lessons that I've learned. The first thing is that you have to understand nobody knows what they're doing. It's like the most helpful thing when you enter a team like this. It's like you think that, wow, these people work in VR, they work in AI, they know everything, but also they've been in this field for like 6 months, a year, not that long, you know? Even if they had been in it for 3 years, everything is changing. Nothing has been solved. There's more problems than there's answers. So I think just internalizing and realizing that like no one really knows what they're doing, including you, and we're all figuring it out together. That's like the baseline. And then that gives you the permission to be like, okay, great. No one knows what they're doing. Let's figure it out together. And that's the part that I really love. And so then it becomes, okay, like as you're figuring things out, what is it that you need to learn? You need to learn the terminologies. You need to understand the space really, really well. Like, what was the history of it? What's been happening today? Watch and read experiences that can help you imagine these like futures. I do think, maybe some people would disagree with me, but I do think science fiction is the best place to start because you get to understand that those are the most creative authors and people that are dreaming up these futures and are actually, in many ways, influencing the imaginations of the people building the products, right? Totally. So they're like foreseeing and foreshadowing these thoughts. So there's that. And then there's understand what's happening around the world. Like take inspiration from your strengths. You bring a unique perspective to this industry. When I first joined the VR team, one of the things that I was a bit worried about was that everyone in this industry is, from like a video gaming background or is from like a very deep VR or video gaming background. And like, I don't have that background. I did work in video games for a bit, but I think differently. Like, I come from a different country. I'm one of the only females in the room of 100 men. But it took me a while to get comfortable with understanding, actually, this is the immense value I bring to this table. I have a different perspective. I have a filmmaking background. I went to architecture school. Like, all of these experiences will help me design unique patterns and unique solutions in this space, which is desperately needed for this place to go from where it is right now, early stage, to something that can be accepted by everybody around the world because of the different perspectives that are bringing in and making it more relatable. And I think that applies to every single field. Like in AI, you can't just have research scientists, technical people working in AI forever. You need the people that don't know anything about it so that they can also start making it relatable and understandable and say, actually, this phrase regenerate means nothing to me. I don't understand that. Like, what if we use this other word that like maybe seems similar? So you need these types of unique experiences. So leaning into your strengths, leaning into your superpowers, all of that. So these are just some examples of like the things that I think can help you make that mindset shift going into a brand new team as an early product designer in an emerging tech space, and give you the confidence and the permission to disrupt that space and bring in your unique twist.
What have you learned about navigating ambiguity when there's really just no clear playbook to follow in these types of roles?
I joined the AI team 5 years ago. So as the first designer joining this team, I had to understand first and foremost, like, what is this space? And to understand what this space and to navigate that ambiguity, the sheer ambiguity of there's all these AI models out there. It's super technical. I'm reading these white papers. They don't make any sense. There's all this terminology that's just like out of this world. How do I influence people that are making all this? Like, how do I even work with them? What do I even do? What do I even build? The thing that helped me the most was immersing myself deeply. So I actually just became curious about things, super curious about things, and started doing side projects outside of work. What I first did was I came across these models that help colorize black and white photos and videos. And I'm from Pakistan. I grew up there, and I was going through this time where I wanted to like connect deeper with the history of my country. So I started colorizing black and white photos and videos before 1947 of Pakistan and India, and starting to just like learn about the history and post these on Instagram. Now, these models were like, today you can go into Photoshop and colorize things easily. You couldn't do that back then. Like, I had to understand what are the limitations of this model. Okay, it hasn't been trained on brown faces. Okay, it doesn't really know the colors that were being worn in India at that time. And slowly I started to learn about the limitations of the model, how to retrain it, how to leverage these models, who to give feedback to, what are all the terminologies being used in this. And then as I started doing this project, it started gaining traction and people became really interested in AI as an art form. And there was a lot of education that I was doing at the same time and learning myself. And then I started to uncover newer models as I was doing this. Okay, now I can recreate lost architecture and complete photos where maybe, let's say, like half of the building has been destroyed. Like, okay, technology is improving. I see there's this new model where I can like complete the image of this architecture that has been lost. Or I can start to animate these faces with live portrait and face tracking. And now I can like bring these historical figures to life, or I can clone their voice. And slowly I'm learning about all these different AI technologies and these models and learning how to use them for a side project that's actually in the end making me way better at my daytime job. And I was able to do all this just by being curious and wanting to like do something cool with it.
I love how it ties back to something that you actually cared about and that was meaningful to you and that you were doing on your own time, rather than just like, just opening up a white paper and treating it more as homework.
Yeah, it was fun. It was meaningful. It inspired a lot of people, and I learned a ton. Like right now I can tell the story and it's beautiful, but back then it was just fun and curiosity.
What were some of the opinions that you have formed through this experimentation process then?
think the number one opinion that I formed that I feel quite strongly about, and it influences my work even 5 years later, is that creativity is going to be more and more democratized as time goes on, and it already has. At first, I used to think it's a weird concept, like, why does creativity need to be democratized? Like, people are creative, they're already like experimenting. But as I started experimenting with these side projects, and as I started sort of like working with researchers at work, I started to realize that people think about creativity in very like black and white ways. They think they're either creative or they're not creative. There's no in between. They're not like, oh, I might be a little creative, but I could be more. It's like, no, I can either draw or I can't draw. Like, that's it. And I don't think that's great. Everyone is creative. Everyone has creativity in them. And so that research really sort of inspired this future for me of like, how can I democratize creativity? How can I make everyone in the world feel like if they have an idea, they can easily bring it to life? So that's a pretty strong opinion I hold, is that that is what AI can and will and has been enabling for people. And a lot of the product experiences that we're building, yes, it's going to scare people because it's like making creativity too easy for people, but it's also unlocking and enabling a lot of potential for people to communicate better.
I know you can't share in detail of some of the things that you're working on right now, but are there other projects or things that you can point to that indicate how you as a designer respond to these insights from the research of creativity being more binary in people's minds?
When sort of I had this learning and I was in this AI research team, one of the ways we had set up this team was, can design inspire these futures and then go back to the AI researchers and say, hey, here's like a really cool demo I've made. These are the gaps in the modeling side. Can we start to bridge the gap here? But again, no playbook for this. We're all learning as we're doing this. So I was designing many futuristic, inventive prototypes on how can I democratize creativity. This was pre-DALL-E, so we didn't have generative AI back then. I just had one mission. How can I get people to express what's on their mind in the most easy way? And I built all these prototypes for different scenarios. And one of the demos I had built was the ability for children to just say a story and watch it come to life. And so you could say, you know, like, there's a girl and she's wearing a red cape and she's like walking down the road and she comes across a fox. And as the child is saying this, these images are coming to life in front on her screen and it's animating the whole experience. And so I put together this demo because DALL-E was not a thing back then. We were actually like pulling in images from the web, like PNGs and transparent backgrounds, and layering them and like generating dialogue. And it was quite inventive for that time. So super cool prototype. I built a design demo for it. I worked with an engineer then to like build the actual working demo of it. And then we sort of like researched it with kids. And it was huge. Like, parents and kids were just like having the best time bonding over an experience like this. In that experience, what I learned was that this is all great, but there's a limitation where people actually want to see these characters, these images come to life. Like, it feels too bland if it's just like PNGs and stuff put together. And so the gap that showed up was that in the AI model world, there's no way to animate images like these and bring them to life. And so I worked with a researcher then to put together a demo where we can start training and building a model that can help us animate drawings. And so for that, we built a whole demo experience that we ended up launching where kids can draw a drawing, they can upload it, and then that drawing can then run, jump, dance, experiences like that. We put that out there really just to get like, you know, we had to collect data. We had to collect data of like people drawing, the model improving over time. But what actually ended up happening was that like parents and kids around the world just loved using that demo in itself. Even though we were using that to train the data, it was basically an experience that people just found a lot of joy in and started to sort of experience like a game itself. So that's a long story, but it's an example of sort of having a strong feeling, thought about the future, which was democratizing creativity, building wild demos that I was like, no one would care about, but I really believe in this future, inspiring people around me that this is a future that they should also understand the value in. And then as a result, influencing the technology that's built. And now that technology is probably inspiring and creating products around the world. So that's been a journey that I'm quite proud of, to be honest, because it's been a really fun one.
There's so much to unpack there. I want to go just a little bit deeper even on just the prototyping process. Like, how are you exploring these really early ideas when things are even unshaped in your own mind? And what does it take to bring them to life in that prototype?
You have to understand the technology first and foremost, but then you also have to design a future that's like a step ahead of that technology. For this example specifically. So for example, I think this is true for both when I was in the VR team and in AI. Sometimes the prototyping tools will not be able to do what you want it to do because of the limitations of the technology. So how do I sort of like leverage my strengths and skills to bring ideas to life so I can inspire the people around me on how we can bridge the gap between where the tech is today and where we want it to be? A good example of that in VR was we were using Unity to like prototype experiences, but sometimes like Premiere, After Effects was just able to provide that value as well. And you could like prototype, like I could use my filmmaking background to like really communicate. Back then we had like came up with this reticle concept of everything was sort of like gaze-based interactions, and we were trying to prototype these gaze-based interactions. And, you know, you can start making animations in After Effects and then take that into Unity and communicate to people like, this is how this reticle should behave and interact. It's not Figma. It's not origami. It's none of those things. Like, you're using a tool that makes sense for you back then. So today with AI, you know, let's say there's a model that is limited in what it can do, but you're like, I want this problem solved. This is how I think it's solved. I think your goal almost is to design and build that future prototype, whether it's like an inspiring video or it's a origami prototype or it's a whatever tool you use. It's storytelling at the end of the day. Like, how do you put together a compelling enough vision that's not so off track that people are like, that's never going to be possible, but it communicates the essence of what you're trying to communicate. Taking that same example of democratizing creativity, one of the demos I had built was around children's storytelling. Another demo that I was quite interested in was, can I just sort of communicate what I'm trying to talk about and then sort of like have things appear on the screen as I'm communicating it. One of the problems I was interested in solving was that like we have all this data out in the world in our phone and our laptop. And when the time comes to like tell someone about one of those things, you're like, wait, let me look for it. Like, I'm trying to find it and I can't find it. And it's like buried in those experiences. So I was trying to build a prototype around that. And I could just build a prototype that shows Maheen typed this and then this thing appeared. But I actually built a whole story around it where I went out and I like recorded my friends struggling to have a conversation, scrolling on their phone for a long time, finding that thing and then showing it to their friend. So I'm showing to my stakeholders, hey, look, this is a problem. Does this resonate? I'm sure you've had this problem. Then I'm showing them, okay, like imagine this future. And then I'm showing like how the life of these two people is changing with that product prototype that I gave to them. Wow, look like how that took like 5 seconds versus like the first video took 2 minutes. And so that whole thing is storytelling. Like I really just created an extravagant narrative to help communicate to people the problem, the solution, and sort of like the improvement in a life. So at least that's how I go about it when it comes to prototyping. It's not just the prototype itself, but it's the surrounding narrative around it.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, even when we say the word prototype, I think people picture the like interactive Figma mock-up and the little blue boxes and everything. But even thinking about video as a prototype is so interesting because it's like, no, at the end of the day, you are just trying to inspire people with some kind of an artifact, and it doesn't necessarily have to be interactive software even.
Yeah, you're basically making movies. And I think you had Alex Cornell on your podcast, and he kind of like is sort of really great at it too, where he helps create these videos and narratives around like convincing people. And really that's the power of movies, is they change minds. Prototypes change minds, movies change minds, visual mediums change minds. And I like to tell people, figure out what your medium is. Maybe it's writing, maybe it's video, whatever it is, do that.
You said something else that I want to double click on, where you talked about training this animation model. What's the designer's role in that process? Because I think a lot of people hear that and it just automatically translates into code in their mind. And well, that's an engineering thing to figure out.
Depending on the project, it can differ, but there's a lot of intricacies. Like, so we built this demo to train the model. Well, why are we doing this? Well, we need data from people. Okay. What kind of data do you need? Okay. How do we figure out the feature set and the product around that kind of data? There's good data and bad data. Okay. We kind of need all types of data, but we need more good data than bad data. Okay, great. How do we give people guidance on what type of data they're providing us? Provide images that are of these types of experiences and take a photo that's in a well-lit area. These are all design considerations. Once this experience is sort of figured out for the data side, then there's, okay, how do we take user input into actually steering the model better, into fine-tuning it after it's been made? How do we create those loopholes? There's a whole, it's quite deep, right? I think designers are used to building feedback flows for products, but they're not used to building feedback for models. And I think even just understanding that when you build an AI product, it starts as quite basic, and maybe it has a lot of faults, but it can actually become quite powerful and really good over time. But that really good state only happens if you're building in these feedback loops and mechanisms for the customer to talk to the model and for the researchers and the engineers to set up that product flow in a way that it improves over time. So I think a designer's role is to just make sure all that is crisp and it's improving over time, and that we're not over-promising and we're not under-delivering and we're being transparent. And, take a step back. It's okay, you can do all this, but also there's a lot of new interaction design patterns that you're introducing to people. I said regenerate earlier, and maybe regenerate is becoming more of a common thing for people. But even this idea of AI, I see the word AI being used everywhere in the industry right now. But we assume people know what AI is. People kind of don't know what AI is. And how are you communicating that to people? There's a big issue in the AI industry right now around branding and content design and patterns that don't really make sense for the AI industry and the AI products. A designer is going to solve that, right? That's where our role is. So a lot of problems for a designer to solve when it comes to building AI products.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about the word regenerate, because something that Colin Dunn from Visual Electric was talking to me about is how you name things in design has never been more important. And creating these mental models that make AI more approachable and intuitive. And a lot of the words that we get out of the box are inherently technical. How do you make that something that, my mom wants to use?
And I think even when it comes to the design patterns that are being used right now, I at first was an advocate of we should just be reusing existing patterns because people are used to it. But I think as the AI industry is maturing, it's becoming pretty clear that the existing patterns are just not it. They're limited in what they can do. And AI is introducing new behaviors and patterns, but we have to invent new patterns that are potentially grounded in things that seem familiar to people, concepts that seem familiar. So for example, remixing is a thing that people often use. And I think the concept of a remix or a clone is more familiar to people. So you can say, okay, let's build upon that and give that to people. But, maybe even that's not clear enough. Can we do a better job coming up with something that duplicating or things like that? What is it that people will really understand? And then what is the iconography for it? And there's just all these new things that we have to think of. People don't really need to know if it's AI, but they need to understand what is happening. And the day we reach there with these new patterns, then I'll be okay, I feel this industry is maturing. But right now I feel we're so far from it. There's maybe only a handful of designers that I know of that are truly challenging the interaction patterns in AI right now. And that's the thing that I'm most curious about and interested in, is seeing how we can push that forward.
Is there an example that you can share of someone that you look at as really challenging the status quo?
I will say on Twitter recently, I've come across these students whose thesis is all about just identifying new patterns. They're going really deep on interaction. They're going really deep on what if I could just reimagine how web pages exist? What if I could just reimagine how a eyedropper works? I think it's those kinds of experiences, people that are going really, really deep on just a question and are like, what if we just reimagine this whole thing? What are all the possibilities that it can enable? It's posts and experiences like that that have been really inspiring me, because it's teaching me to also break away from the patterns that I know. We're so used to, as designers, working within the constraints of a system that sometimes we forget to be playful and imaginative, kind of like those future worlds that I was communicating about earlier. How can we take a step back and just like really reimagine something and then come back to our constraints and say, okay, this is an epiphany I have. This is how I think it can work. How does it apply to something like this? I forget who this was, but I think some of the cool things I've been seeing in this space come up are, how can you use graphs to communicate like image generation changing over time? Like, let's say you have axes of like old and young. Maybe you have like sort of styles like Ghibli style, sci-fi, anime, pixelated. And instead of just like telling people to type in these words and become prompt engineers, what if you gave people graphs or like these like interactive components where they can just like move some dots around and just like play with things? What if you just made these experiences more playful, that it felt like you were just exploring versus having to think about, what word should I use to generate this image? How can we make that go away? And how can we make these interaction patterns that are just playful? I think even natural language, like earlier I said, you know, I have this dream that like people can just say what's on their mind and it'll come to life. Even that's kind of complicated, because now you have to think about, well, what do I have to say to make this thing do what I need it to do? Right? We're like pretty far from understanding intent really well. So until we get there, okay, now we need to think of more creative ways. There's another demo that I came across recently. I know that this demo was really just trying to like make a point, but I thought it was crazy and amazing at the same time. The intent of the demo was to communicate to you that when you're talking to a voice chatbot, it can be really unsafe because it can basically take your voice recording and basically learn how to sound like you. And so the way that it had built this demo was, you answer some questions, you're talking to this AI through like a voice chat, and then all of a sudden it'll change its voice and start sounding like you. And you're like, whoa, how did that happen? That's crazy. And I've built demos like that where you're training people's voices and you get them to read a story, and then you get them to read like for 2 minutes. And then, you know, you'll be like, okay, your voice is ready. But in this demo, you were just having a conversation with someone and it just then started speaking your voice back to you. And it was the craziest thing. And I understand that they were trying to make a point about safety, but I thought it was so interesting.
It reminds me of some of the demos that I've been seeing on Twitter recently. People creating these videos that are indistinguishable from reality. And it kind of puts this like question in the back of my head. And I'm curious if you have to deal with this tension as someone designing these types of experiences. Where's the line between what we should do just because now it is technically possible versus what is good for people and society and all of the ethical considerations that come into play there? So is that something that you have to think about? And what are some of those questions that you find yourself asking to figure out where that line exists?
This is a really good question. More than ambiguity, I find this part the hardest working in emerging tech, because for sure, you're going to face experiences and come into situations where you're like, I don't want this future. Of course, it will happen all the time. It's happened to me so many times where I've sat in a room and been like, I'm not building this. This is not the future I want. And then I have to remember, like, I'm here for a reason. Like, I get to steer this future. I am in the driver's seat, and I will try my best to steer in a direction that feels right to me. For most of my career, that's how it's felt, where I've been like, okay, I disagree with this. This is how I'm going to communicate it. And everyone in the industry wants a good future. No one's badly intentioned about wanting to build a dystopian future. So you're able to convince people, you're able to get things back on track. Recently, I've had an interesting experience and a learning where I felt that way about one of the experiences I was building. I was like, I don't really know. I don't know if I want to work on this. This doesn't really align with my box of values, but it may align with someone else's box of values. And then I kind of like went away from it. And then I came back to it and I realized that like I thought of something a certain way, but there's actually a lot of opportunity and value in problems to be solved. And just to concretely put some thoughts to like what this is. So recently I've been designing AI chat experiences for people. You know, think about like custom AIs that you can sort of interact with and chat with and build experiences with to like provide values to people that follow you on Instagram or to even like yourself for the problems that you want to solve in your day. So we've been building these like custom AI chat experiences. We launched this a few weeks ago. It's really hard to understand the value of something like this. Again, maybe mentioning my playbook of how I navigate ambiguity. When I enter a project like this, I'm like, I don't really understand this. And then I try to play around with it, and then I either do or don't understand the value. So what I did was I have a podcast called Fake ID, and I leverage mostly AI tools to make this podcast so that I can learn about sort of like the space. And one of the things I became really fascinated about was, okay, I have all this content for my podcast. What if I made a chatbot that was trained on my podcast content and then people could go chat with this podcast? And then I became even more fascinated with the idea of, okay, wow, what if people could call this AI chatbot and it would respond in my voice, and then my AI could just interview people. And then I would just have all this content. And, you know, I just started going crazy with it. And then I started experimenting with like APIs where I could like clone my voice and get this chatbot to like sound like me. And then the more I started to go deeper on this side project, I started to uncover so many opportunities as a creator, as a podcast host, as an experimenter, and started to become comfortable with this idea that actually I think there's a lot of value in custom AI experiences. And it took me days to build these experiences, but what if somebody could just do this with a few clicks? And what value would that unlock for business owners, creators, entertainers, things like that? So again, this is a side project, but it's helping me inform my perspectives on where I think these LLMs and these chatbots and these experiences could head in the future.
Hey guys, real quick, if you know me, then you know I love products. So I want to take just 30 seconds to tell you about 3 of my favorites. Now, anytime that I'm designing and building a website, you better believe that I'm going to use Framer. I made the switch recently and I'm never going back. Now, once it's time to animate my designs and showcase my work, that's when I'm going to use Jitter. It's like Figma, only for motion design. And every step of the way, I'm going to be using Raycast constantly. It's the cornerstone of how I use my computer and the way that I stay in flow while I work. Now, I hand-selected Framer, Raycast, and Jitter to partner with me so that I could do these interviews full-time. So if you want to show them some love, it would mean a lot. Okay, now on to the rest of the episode. Something I think a lot about stems from an idea that I heard Kevin Rose share on a podcast like last year at some point. And he talked about a future where maybe people right now who are listening to this episode, say we say something that sparks some curiosity, or maybe there's a question that I missed that I didn't go deeper on. People could actually hit pause and ask either one of us a question and have the model extend our own ideas in a way that provides more context for listeners. And it's like, okay, as soon as I heard that, I'm like, that is interesting. That makes sense.
Yeah. It creates a little steer. I mean, there's so many experiences like that, right? And there's just so many products out there that have challenged the way I've thought about the future too. Like there's all these chatbot experience products that are on the daily, like teaching me something new. I say this to everyone I chat with. I love the product Rosebud. Shout out to Rosebud. It's a journaling app experience. I think it's one of the first AI apps, one of the second AI apps that I'm like, wow, like this is really useful. You've done a great job sort of taking the technology, making it a little transparent in the back, but then providing value to people. It's basically a journal that speaks back to you. And even just that framing of like, talk to a journal and it'll reflect back to you what it's listening from you or what's hearing from you and helping you identify patterns and helping you just sort of like understand yourself better. There's so much value in that. And I think that is really like, it's experiences like that that change my perspective on what are the values these things can provide. And really then it becomes the packaging and the framing of the products that can make something ethical, not ethical, the security of it, the privacy of it. But there is value. I think we can't deny the value. It's the execution and the frameworks and the systems that make something unethical in my perspective.
I mean, it speaks to the value of design even.
Yeah.
Just we are the ones that visualize the potential features and how these products can be used and the core narrative surrounding them, especially in these types of companies and environments that you're working in.
That's why I think every designer should be thinking about emerging tech, should be thinking about AI. At some point, I still believe this, though, with the recent AI boom, I'm like, okay, maybe I feel this a bit less, but I used to believe that every designer would have to learn 3D at some point. I still kind of believe it, but now I'm more convinced that every designer needs to learn how to work with technology in general, like really just understand the ins and outs. And right now it's AI, eventually it may be 3D, spatial design really. And I do think every designer has to sort of like adapt to the changing environment so that they can have the right level of influence on product. It's really hard to be in an AI team and like build a product and then steer the direction of it if you don't really understand it, because things will just slip under you and you will not really understand what's happening. I'll give a good example of this. Like one thing I noticed really often with designers and teams is an engineer will tell them this isn't possible and they'll be like, okay, not possible. And then they'll just go off. If you know how the technology works, you can challenge back. Sometimes the engineers don't even know, right? And you challenge by understanding the technology yourself and saying, hey, like I actually did see this demo in the industry elsewhere. Like how come they're able to do it and we're not able to do it? Let's try to unpack that. Let's understand that. Are we using the right model? Maybe we can do X, Y, Z to like really make sure that the value is being delivered to the user. I've just seen this happen so many times in emerging tech where people just take the answer as is, but often that's not the right way, because again, no one knows what they're doing. So we're all learning as we're going.
Let's talk a little bit more about that then, because you've immersed yourself in this space now for a while. What are some of the core insights that you've learned about just like how these models work and what they make possible that you think other designers who have a little bit of curiosity but maybe don't have your background could really benefit from understanding or even just using as a launching point for their own experimentation?
I think the first thing is understanding that AI is not magic. Magic does not happen. Like there's a process to this. With LLM specifically, it's predicting the next word, right? There's no reasoning behind it. It's not smart. If you really understand that it's just a type of a foundational model and how it's operating, then you start to understand why it's hallucinating, why it's making things up, why is accuracy low? Okay, can we make sure that the accuracy is high in every response, and what are confidence scores? And like really just understanding how the LLM works can help you kind of understand the limitations, the opportunities, and all that stuff. I think the interesting thing about LLMs is that there's still a lot that's unknown. So let's say I'm like talking with a research scientist about like, I need X done. What can we do? Often the answer I get is we don't know. Like we actually don't know if what the LLM would say, or like whether it can or can't do this. And so you're just kind of trying to find guardrails together as a team. From what I understand is we know certain ways the LLM works. It's predictive in some ways, but it's also a black box at the same time. And so what I find fascinating is that if this is true, what I'm saying, the amount of LLM experiences out there is like wild. Like everything is just repackaged with an LLM chatbot experience or like a wrapper around it. But we're all still learning how these LLMs operate, especially as they improve over time. And we are starting to see really interesting experiences where there's capabilities and tools that these LLMs are paired with that then make these experiences more powerful. So like Claude Artifacts is a great example of something that is like enabling these like unique experiences and really like sort of making it easier for people to visualize and be more multimodal with their experiences. So then understanding on top of the LLMs, like what are these core tools and capabilities that help a designer push the potential of where it can go, like multimodality. I think those are some of the interesting things that a designer going into a product like this can start to think about, like, how is this technology improving over time? Where are these models headed? What is next in these experiences? And yeah, and just like following the sort of thought leaders in this space that are sharing sort of how these technologies are evolving over time is kind of at least the way I go about it.
You mentioned curiosity. What are some of the other skills that you think become more valuable specifically for designers who are working on AI native products?
I wonder if curiosity is it. Like, I'm actually trying to think, like, yes, you need to be a good prototyper. Yes, you need to like technically understand what's happening. You need to be a good communicator. You need to navigate ambiguity. But actually, all of that comes naturally if you're curious. So I think all of that is important, but really, if you don't have curiosity, then I really worry about these other skills and whether you're able to execute on them.
I like it. Well, let's zoom out really quickly then. You said a phrase that I found pretty interesting. You said the goalposts for what it means to be a designer are shifting. What do you mean by that?
I think what I mean by that is that there's two types of people that I interact with these days. There's people that are like, AI is changing everything. I'm so scared. Like, I don't want this future. And then there's designers that are curious and are like, oh my gosh, I used Midjourney to do XYZ and I made this really cool thing and this is sick. And, you know, they're using it in their design process too. You basically want to be the latter, because if you're not adapting to this and you're sort of like surprised by everything that's happening and or maybe think you're not working in AI, so this isn't really impacting you. The industry is just changing so quickly, and you don't have to learn everything. You don't have to keep up with everything. I understand the industry is changing every day, every week. I was on vacation for 2 weeks and I came back and I was like, the whole industry has changed. Like, now I need to catch up, you know? That's okay. You don't need to be the expert or stay up to date, but you need to be open to these changes, because it will only make you a better designer. It's kind of like, as Figma is coming out with new features, you want to learn how to like use those features so that you can be more efficient as a designer. As the industry is coming out with new features, new technologies, new experiences, you want to learn how these work. What are these things? Like, how are people using them so you can be a better designer? So in the lightning course that I did last week around design in the era of artificial intelligence, I cover what are the tools I use to improve storytelling as a designer. Like, I'm bringing my personas to life using 11 Labs and image generation, and I'm crafting these stories with this user in an airport and this user in like a market and like visualizing it. I would not be able to do any of that before because I'm a terrible drawer. Like, I cannot draw and I cannot make those beautiful storyboards that maybe other designers can, but today I can. And it just makes me more efficient as a designer. So the goalposts are changing because there's going to be designers that are becoming extremely efficient in communicating their ideas and convincing their stakeholders. And you want to sort of be on that. And if you're not on that, then there's just going to be a delta between you and the designers around you. And it's not to scare you or put pressure on people. It's really just to be like, hey, let's keep learning. Let's keep being curious. Let's keep growing as designers and creatives in the industry.
Well, for people who are listening and are inspired and feeling curious and motivated, you also have a course where you go much deeper on this stuff. So maybe you could even just give us a little bit of a preview of what's that about, who's it for, and what can people expect to get out of it?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things I also noticed in the industry is that there's a ton of courses out there that are about learn how to be a prompt engineer and learn how to make beautiful images. I'm not interested in that. I'm not going to be teaching you tools you can use in your design flow. There's a lot of content out there. But what I do think is important is that designers need to learn how to work with AI. And there's a lot of designers that want to join an AI team, or maybe they just find that their team has become an AI team and they don't know how to navigate that. So it's a 3-week course. It's built for professional industry, anyone that has a full-time job. It's supposed to be low commitment. Everything will be recorded live and you can participate async. And the way I've structured the course is in the first week, we'll really share the fundamentals of AI and ML, really just helping you understand the terminologies, how LLMs work, what are the principles when it comes to designing for this space. In the second week, we'll go deep on AI-powered products. I'll be sharing a lot of case studies, talking a lot about existing interaction patterns and opportunities for interaction patterns. And we'll try to solve some of these problems together. Like, how can we start pushing the boundaries of what is possible in the industry today, and how can we be more innovative? And then the third week, it's about, okay, let's say you are a manager, or let's say you're a designer looking to join an AI team. What are the skills that design managers are looking for? How do you tell interviewers that, like, hey, I do know how to navigate ambiguity. I do know how to be curious. I am curious about AI. How do you package all that up and kind of like go into a team with confidence? And if you're not looking for a job and you're in a job already, like, how do you communicate with your stakeholders?
Quick note, if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to go deeper and you're interested in Maheen's course, I asked her if she would give a discount to Dive Club listeners, and she said yes. So head to dive.club/Maheen. That's MAHEEN, and you can get $200 off of her course. Amazing. Well, Maheen, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing a little bit about your journey and some of the things you're thinking about. Super inspiring, and we appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Hey, it's Rid. Don't forget, if you want to go even deeper, each week I send an email out to over 10,000 designers with bonus resources and key takeaways from these conversations. So head to dive.club/email to sign up. Okay, I'll see you next week.